In the Mississippi Delta in the early 1980s, promises were rarely formal. They were not written down. They were not signed. They existed as understanding, reinforced by reputation, history, and expectation. According to accounts from that period, the agreement that would later define this story was made quietly. No public meeting, no witnesses outside those involved. It concerned access. Not money directly, not land ownership in the legal sense, but use. Use of a piece of land near the river. Use of equipment stored there. Use of routes that had been relied on for years. For the men involved, this was not unusual. Such arrangements were common, especially in places where formal processes moved slowly and trust filled the gaps. The understanding was simple. One side would be allowed continued access. In return, certain conditions would be respected. Nothing extravagant. Nothing that suggested future conflict. At the time, there was no reason to believe the promise would not be kept. The men involved had known each other for years. Some were related by blood, others by long-standing association. They attended the same gatherings, worked the same land, moved through the same routines. From the outside, the agreement appeared stable because the relationships behind it were stable. For months, nothing changed. Access continued, work continued. There were no confrontations. Life in the Delta moved at its usual pace. But promises do not break all at once. They erode. According to later recollections, the first signs were subtle. A gate left locked when it had always been open. Equipment moved without notice. A route quietly blocked. None of these actions were openly explained, and none were immediately challenged. In environments governed by informal rules, direct confrontation is often delayed. People wait. They observe. They assume misunderstandings will correct themselves. But as weeks passed, it became clear that something had shifted. Access was no longer guaranteed. The promise still existed in memory, but not in practice. What made the situation dangerous was not the change itself, but the absence of explanation. No one clarified whether the agreement had been terminated. No one formally renegotiated. Silence replaced communication, and silence, in this context, was not neutral. It created space for interpretation. For some, the broken promise was seen as disrespect. For others, as a calculated move. According to later statements, those affected debated their next steps privately. Not to escalate, at least not yet. At first, the response was restraint. There were attempts to resolve the issue indirectly. Messages passed through intermediaries. Questions were raised without accusation. But the lack of response confirmed what many had already begun to suspect. The promise was no longer being honored, and no explanation was coming. This was the moment where the situation could still have been contained. A conversation, a clarification, even a refusal stated openly. But none of that happened. Instead, each side retreated into its own interpretation of events. Trust, once assumed, became conditional. And conditional trust does not hold long. By late summer of 1982, the agreement existed only as a point of contention. It was no longer about access. It was about what the broken promise implied. Because in places where formal systems rarely intervene, a promise is more than convenience. It is structure. And once that structure fails, people begin to rely on something else to restore balance. That shift, from trust to calculation, marked the true beginning of the Delta reckoning, even though, at the time, no one would have described it that way. The first response to the broken promise was not confrontation, it was caution. According to accounts from that period, those affected did not immediately assume intent. They assumed error. a misunderstanding, a delay that would correct itself. This assumption shaped what came next. Instead of direct action, there was observation. Men who had once moved freely through familiar areas began to alter their routines. Routes were changed slightly. Visits became less frequent, conversations shorter, nothing that would attract attention. In the Delta, visible reactions are often avoided until they are unavoidable. Privately, questions were asked, not face to face. Through intermediaries, through people who were trusted by both sides, the messages were restrained. Was the agreement still valid? Had something changed? Was there an explanation? No clear answer came back. In some cases, there was no response at all. That silence carried weight. Because silence, when a promise has been broken, is rarely interpreted as neutrality. It is interpreted as position. As weeks passed, the lack of clarification hardened assumptions. According to later recollections, those affected began to consider alternatives. Not escalation, not retaliation, at least not yet. But preparation began. Schedules were adjusted, equipment was relocated. People stopped relying on access they no longer controlled. These were practical decisions, framed as precaution. But precaution has consequences. Each adjustment reduced contact. Each reduction weakened the informal ties that had once prevented conflict. Meanwhile, the other side made no visible effort to restore the agreement. From the outside, life continued normally. There were no public disputes, no raised voices, no formal complaints. But privately, alignment began to form. People spoke to those they trusted. Comparisons were made with previous disputes that had ended badly. According to local accounts, the story began to change. What had first been described as a misunderstanding was now described as a test, a measure of how far boundaries could be pushed. This reframing mattered. Because once a situation is seen as intentional, restraint starts to look like weakness. Still, nothing happened, and that delay created a false sense of stability. Looking back, some residents would later say that this was the most dangerous phase. Not because anything violent occurred, but because everyone involved believed there was still time. Time to fix it. Time to avoid escalation. That belief was reinforced by the absence of immediate consequences. No authority intervened, no external pressure appeared. According to publicly available records, there were no formal disputes filed during this period. Everything remained unofficial, which meant resolution depended entirely on personal judgment. And personal judgment varies. By early autumn of 1982, the first response had run its course. Restraint had not restored the promise. Silence had not clarified intentions. Instead, the situation had become defined by uncertainty. Uncertainty about access, uncertainty about respect, uncertainty about what would happen next. It was during this phase that the idea of reversal began to fade. Not because anyone wanted conflict, but because restoring balance now seemed to require more than conversation. According to later accounts, people began to speak less about fixing the agreement and more about responding to its violation. This shift did not happen all at once. It happened quietly, across separate conversations, in separate places. No single moment marked the change. But by the time the first response ended, the situation had moved into a new phase. One where restraint was no longer seen as resolution, and where the absence of action began to feel like a decision in itself. By the time winter approached the Delta in late 1982, the situation had entered a quieter phase. Not calmer, quieter. According to later recollections, This was the period when communication almost completely stopped. Not because there was nothing to say, but because both sides believed they already understood the other's position. Silence became the dominant language. In place of explanation, there were assumptions. In place of negotiation, there were calculations. People began choosing where they stood, not publicly, not formally, quietly. Alignment did not happen through meetings or declarations. It happened through proximity. Who spoke to whom? Who shared information? Who stopped answering calls? In the Delta, these shifts are noticed quickly. According to local accounts, familiar gatherings changed. Some people stopped attending events they had always been part of. Others arrived earlier or left sooner. None of this was dramatic, but it was visible to those who knew what to look for. This phase mattered because it removed ambiguity. Until then, there had been space for misunderstanding. Now, positions hardened. People no longer spoke in terms of if. They spoke in terms of when something would have to be done, when balance would have to be restored. At the same time, no one openly acknowledged what was happening. Outwardly, life continued. Work was done. Families followed routines. Public spaces remained shared. But privately, trust networks reorganized. According to later statements, this was when individuals began preparing for outcomes they had previously dismissed. Not specific actions, but possibilities, contingencies. What would happen if access was permanently denied? What would happen if respect could not be recovered? What would happen if the situation escalated beyond private control? These were not questions asked aloud. They were questions asked internally. And the answers varied. For some, restraint still seemed possible. For others, it began to feel inadequate. The absence of external intervention reinforced this divide. No authority stepped in to clarify the agreement. No formal mediation was offered. According to public records, there was still no official dispute. Everything remained informal, which meant every interpretation carried weight. By mid-November, the silence itself became a message. It signaled that the broken promise would not be addressed through explanation. It would be addressed through outcome. This realization marked a turning point. Because once people believe resolution will not come through dialogue, their behavior changes. They become less concerned with being understood and more concerned with being prepared. According to later accounts, this was when the phrase, "it's gone too far," first began to circulate. Not shouted, not declared, mentioned quietly, as an observation. Yet even then, no one believed the final outcome was inevitable. There was still a belief, unspoken but present, that escalation could stop short of irreversible consequences. That belief kept things contained, for a time. But alignment has momentum. Once sides form, neutrality becomes difficult. Those who attempted to remain outside the situation found themselves pressured to choose, not through threats, through expectation. Silence, again, played its role. Not responding was interpreted as position. Not showing up was interpreted as distance. And distance, in this context, was interpreted as alignment with the other side. By the end of November 1982, the Delta reckoning had entered a phase where reversal would require more than intent. It would require someone to step back first. According to later recollections, no one was willing to be that person. Because stepping back now carried its own risk. Risk of appearing weak. Risk of losing standing. Risk of conceding something that, once lost, might never be recovered. This is how silence stopped being neutral. It became structural. And once silence becomes structure, events tend to follow a path that feels logical to those inside it, even when it appears avoidable to everyone else. The alignment was complete. The only question left was how the reckoning would unfold. The reckoning did not arrive as a single moment. It unfolded as a sequence. According to later accounts, the first incident did not appear significant at the time. It was not public. It did not draw attention beyond those already involved. What mattered was not the scale of the event, but its meaning. It confirmed what many had already concluded in silence. That restraint was no longer protecting balance. It was only delaying the inevitable. After that point, the situation changed quickly. Not visibly, not loudly, but decisively. Communication between the two sides stopped entirely. Intermediaries withdrew. Messages went unanswered. According to people familiar with the period, this was when private routines were abandoned. People no longer assumed shared spaces were neutral. Movements became deliberate. Encounters were avoided or carefully timed. The absence of clear boundaries made every interaction uncertain. This uncertainty fed escalation. Each side interpreted the other's actions through the lens of alignment that had already formed. An absence became intentional. A delay became provocation. Silence became defiance. By early December of 1982, the reckoning had fully taken shape, not as a plan, but as momentum. According to later recollections, no one individual directed what followed. There was no central decision, no single order. Instead, actions began occurring in response to assumptions that were never verified. One event led to another, each justified by the one before it. What makes this phase difficult to reconstruct is that it lacked a clear starting line. There was no declaration that the reckoning had begun, only a recognition, shared privately by many, that it was now underway. As events accumulated, the scale became apparent. People who had once believed themselves outside the situation found themselves drawn in by association. According to accounts from the time, involvement was often indirect at first. Being present, providing information, offering assistance that felt minor in isolation. But isolation disappeared quickly. By the time the full extent of the reckoning became visible, 11 men were dead. Not all at once, not in one place, over a period marked by confusion and silence. Publicly, explanations were scarce. According to official records, details were fragmented. Some incidents were treated as isolated. Others remained unresolved. No single narrative captured the whole sequence, and that fragmentation allowed different interpretations to coexist. Within the community, understanding depended on proximity. Those close to the events saw a chain reaction. Those further away saw coincidence. What remained consistent was the absence of clarity. No one could point to a moment where stopping would have been easy. Every opportunity to intervene appeared obvious only in retrospect. According to later reflections, many involved believed the situation had crossed a threshold long before the final outcome. They simply did not know when. By the end of the reckoning, the original promise that had started everything was barely mentioned. It had been replaced by something else. A need to restore standing, a need to resolve imbalance, a need to end uncertainty. The reckoning did not resolve those needs. It only concluded the sequence. And in doing so, it left behind consequences that extended far beyond those directly involved. The community did not return to normal. It adjusted. Silently, after the reckoning ended, there was no clear moment when life resumed. There was no announcement, no official closure, No collective acknowledgement that something irreversible had taken place. According to public records, the Delta communities involved continued to function. Work resumed, businesses reopened, daily routines returned. On the surface, normality appeared to hold. But underneath, the structure had changed. People moved differently. They chose different routes, avoided certain places, adjusted schedules in subtle ways. These changes were rarely discussed openly. They were learned through observation. According to later accounts, trust networks that had existed for decades were permanently altered. Some relationships ended without explanation. Others continued, but with distance. Neutral spaces became rare. Silence, once again, became the dominant feature. This time, it was not the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of conclusion. Officially, the events of late 1982 were never framed as a single sequence. According to available documentation, incidents were handled individually. There was no unified explanation. This fragmentation shaped how the aftermath was remembered. Those close to the events understood the connections. Those further away did not, and that difference mattered. It allowed the broader community to move forward without confronting the full scope of what had happened. Over time, references to the broken promise faded, not because it was forgotten, but because it no longer needed to be explained. Its consequences were visible in behavior, in who was trusted, in who was avoided, in which conversations never happened again. According to later reflections, many believe the reckoning served as a warning, not a formal one, an implicit one, about boundaries, about expectations, about what happens when informal systems fail without replacement. Younger generations heard the story in fragments, not as a lesson, as a caution, told quietly, without detail. By the late 1980s, the phrase, "Don't let it get that far," had entered local language. It was not tied to specifics. Everyone knew what it meant. The Delta did not return to the way it had been before, but it did not collapse either. It adapted, carefully. In the years that followed, agreements became more formal. Access was defined more clearly. Ambiguity was treated with suspicion. The reckoning had reshaped expectations. What began as a broken promise ended as a restructuring of trust. And that outcome, more than the events themselves, defined the aftermath. This is what makes the Delta reckoning of 1982 difficult to summarize. It was not a single incident. It was a process, one that unfolded quietly, escalated gradually, and concluded without resolution. No one involved believed they were creating a legacy. They believed they were responding to circumstances. But circumstances, when left unaddressed, have a way of shaping outcomes far beyond their origin. The reckoning ended, but its structure remained. And in places governed as much by informal rules as by formal ones, that structure continues to influence behavior long after the original cause has faded from memory. The Delta reckoning did not begin with violence. It began with trust. And it ended with a community learning what happens when trust breaks without a way to repair it. In the next story, we'll look at another case where a private agreement unraveled, and the consequences spread further than anyone expected.